The shelling of Manila and the Red Army's grand delusion. The official pretext for war, when it came, was a cynical piece of theater. On November 26, 1939, the Soviet government reported that Finnish artillery had fired upon the Russian village of Manila, killing 4 Red Army soldiers. Foreign correspondents and Finnish border guards confirmed no such shelling had occurred from their side. Archival evidence later proved conclusively that the incident was a false flag operation, orchestrated by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. The shells were Soviet, fired upon Soviet soil. It mattered little. Moscow had its casus belli. An outraged Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, renounced the non-aggression pact between the two nations. 4 days later, on the bitterly cold morning of November 30, 1939, the storm broke. Without a formal declaration of war, 21 divisions of the Red Army, some 450,000 men, supported by over 2,000 tanks and 3,000 aircraft, surged across the Finnish border. The Soviet plan, devised by Leningrad Military District Commander Kirill Meretskov, was built on a foundation of profound arrogance. They expected to be in Helsinki, Finland's capital, within 2 weeks. Political commissars packed dress uniforms for the victory parade, and military bands were instructed to have Shostakovich's suite on Finnish themes ready to play. The Red Army's leadership, decimated by Stalin's purges of 1937–38, which had liquidated over 30,000 of its most experienced officers, was staffed by politically reliable but often incompetent loyalists. They viewed the Finnish army as a negligible force, a bourgeois relic that would shatter at the first blow. Their intelligence assessments were catastrophic, failing to appreciate the terrain, the climate, or, most critically, the resolve of the Finnish people. Want to know more than what's in the textbooks? Subscribe to World War II, Unfiltered, and join our community of history explorers. Your likes and comments help the channel grow. Mannerheim's shield, the geography and strategy of defense. Facing this behemoth was the small, poorly equipped Finnish army. On paper, it was a laughable mismatch. Finland could mobilize around 300,000 men, but possessed only a few dozen obsolete tanks, mostly Vickers 6-tonners, barely enough anti-tank guns to equip its divisions, and an air force of just over 100 planes. Ammunition was so scarce that artillery crews in training were sometimes forced to whisper boom instead of firing live rounds. But Finland had 3 crucial assets. The first was its commander-in-chief, the 72-year-old Baron Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim. A former Tsarist general who had become the symbol of Finnish independence, Mannerheim was a master of defensive warfare. The second asset was the terrain itself, a formidable wilderness of dense forests, thousands of frozen lakes, and trackless swamps, utterly unsuited for the road-bound, mechanized warfare doctrine of the Red Army. The third, and most important, was the Finnish soldier. A nation of hunters, lumberjacks, and skiers, they were intimately familiar with their environment and masters of winter survival. Mannerheim's strategy was brutally realistic. He knew he could not defeat the Red Army, only bleed it until international pressure or Soviet exhaustion forced a settlement. His defensive plan hinged on the Karelian Isthmus, the most direct route to Helsinki. Here, a series of modest, interconnected fortifications known as the Mannerheim Line had been constructed. It was not a grand bastion like the Maginot Line, but a defense-in-depth system of concrete bunkers, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles, expertly woven into the natural landscape. North of the isthmus, along the vast, 1,000-kilometer border, the strategy was one of fluid defense, allow the Soviets to advance along the few existing roads, then sever their supply lines and annihilate them in detail. This would become known as Motti tactics. The birth of the Molotov cocktail and the failure of the first offensive. The initial Soviet onslaught on the Karelian Isthmus was a disaster. Red Army commanders, adhering to rigid, unimaginative doctrine, threw waves of infantry directly at the Mannerheim Line's machine gun nests and pre-sighted artillery zones. Their tank attacks, lacking infantry coordination, were suicidal. The Soviet T-26 and BT series tanks, though numerous, proved vulnerable. Finnish soldiers, lacking sophisticated anti-tank guns, quickly improvised. They discovered that a simple glass bottle, filled with a flammable mixture of gasoline, tar, and potassium chlorate, could be devastating. When thrown against the tank's engine grills, the mixture would ignite, choking the engine and often setting the entire vehicle ablaze. When Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov cynically claimed on state radio that their bombers were not dropping bombs but airlifting food parcels to the starving Finnish people, the Finns wryly dubbed the incendiary bombs Molotov bread baskets. It was only fitting, they joked, that they should provide a drink to go with the food. Thus, the improvised anti-tank grenade was christened the Molotov cocktail, a name that would enter the global lexicon of insurgency. By mid-December 1939, the Red Army's 7th Army had ground to a bloody halt before the Mannerheim line, having suffered tens of thousands of casualties and losing hundreds of tanks. The planned 2-week romp to Helsinki had dissolved into a frozen, humiliating stalemate. The myth of Soviet invincibility was being shattered by a handful of determined men in snow-white camouflage, armed with rifles, submachine guns, and bottles of flammable liquid. The Sausage War, Anatomy of the Motti Tactic. While the world's press focused on the brutal slugging match at the Mannerheim line, a different kind of war was unfolding in the vast, snow-choked forests to the north. Here, the Soviet 9th and 8th Armies advanced along the few primitive logging roads, their columns stretching for miles, like massive steel pythons slithering through the wilderness. This was exactly what the Finnish High Command had anticipated. Small, highly mobile Finnish ski troops, often operating in platoon or company strength, would move silently through the dense woods, invisible in their white camouflage. They would select a point on the road, fell trees, lay mines, and ambush the head and tail of a Soviet column, immobilizing it. Then, the real work began. The Finns would methodically slice the trapped column into smaller, isolated pockets, the Mottis. The term, derived from a Finnish word for a cord of chopped firewood, perfectly described the tactic. The Red Army divisions were the logs, cut into manageable lengths and stacked up to be dealt with one by one. Life inside a Motti was a frozen hell. Cut off from supplies, food, and reinforcements, Soviet soldiers huddled in makeshift shelters as temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. Their vehicles ran out of fuel, their radios went dead, and their rations dwindled. Finnish ski troops, the famed White Death, would harass them relentlessly, appearing from the trees to launch sudden attacks with their Suomi KP/-31 submachine guns, then melting back into the forest. Snipers, masters of concealment, picked off officers and commissars, spreading terror and paranoia. The Finns called this Sota Makara, the Sausage War, because the trapped columns looked like links of sausage on a map. For the encircled Red Army soldiers, it was a slow, agonizing descent into starvation, frostbite, and annihilation. The Battle of Suomussalmi, a masterpiece of annihilation. The most spectacular application of Motti tactics occurred at Suomussalmi in late December 1939 and early January 1940. The Soviet 163rd Rifle Division had advanced and captured the small village, but was quickly encircled by the much smaller Finnish 9th Division under the command of the brilliant Colonel Jalmar Salasvuo. As the 163rd was being systematically strangled, the elite Soviet 44th Motorized Rifle Division, a well-equipped unit from the Kiev Military District, was sent to relieve them. Salasvuo, commanding only 11,000 men, made a daring decision. He would hold the 163rd in its Motti with minimal forces and turn his main effort to ambushing the advancing 44th. On the Rate Road, a narrow track through the forest, the Finns sprang their trap. They felled trees, created roadblocks, and allowed the 44th Division's 20-mile-long column to march deep into the ambush zone before sealing the route behind them. What followed was a week-long massacre. The Finns chopped the 44th Division into a series of distinct Mottis. Soviet soldiers, unequipped for Arctic warfare in their olive-drab uniforms, froze to death in their hundreds. Tanks were immobilized and destroyed by demolition charges. Desperate counterattacks were butchered by Finnish machine guns hidden in the trees. By January 7, 1940, the 44th Division had ceased to exist. The Finns captured a staggering amount of equipment: 43 tanks, 71 field guns, 260 trucks, over 1,100 horses, and thousands of rifles. The Soviet 163rd Division, its hope of rescue gone, was subsequently annihilated. In total, a single Finnish division had destroyed 2 Soviet divisions, inflicting an estimated 23,000 casualties while suffering only 800 of their own. The victory at Suomussalmi sent shockwaves around the world, a stunning David and Goliath triumph that cemented the legend of Finnish martial prowess. The White Death personified, the legend of Simo. Amidst the collective heroism of the Finnish army, the story of one man became a global legend, embodying the terrifying effectiveness of the Finnish soldier. His name was Simo, a quiet farmer from a village near the new border. Standing barely over 5 feet tall, he was an unassuming figure who became, arguably, the deadliest sniper in military history. Stationed on the Kala riverfront, north of Lake Ladoga, Haya operated alone, clad in his white camouflage, often for days at a time in temperatures that would kill a lesser man. His tools were deceptively simple. While other snipers used advanced scopes, Haya preferred the rugged iron sights of his own standard-issue, bolt-action Seiko M/28-30 Mosin Nagant rifle. He argued that telescopic sights could fog up or frost over in the extreme cold and that the glint of sunlight off a lens could betray a sniper's position. Furthermore, using a scope forced a sniper to raise his head higher, creating a bigger target. Haya's methodology was a masterclass in fieldcraft. He would pack down the snow in front of his position to prevent the muzzle blast from disturbing it and revealing his location. He would even keep snow in his mouth to prevent his warm breath from creating a telltale vapor in the freezing air. For 100 days, from November 1939 to March 1940, he hunted Red Army soldiers with chilling efficiency. The Soviets, terrified of this invisible phantom they dubbed Belia Smrt, White Death, mounted counter-sniper operations and even entire artillery barrages just to eliminate him. None succeeded. His official tally, compiled from battlefield records, stands at 505 confirmed rifle kills. In addition to this, he was credited with over 200 kills using a Suomi KP/-31 submachine gun, bringing his total to over 700. His reign of terror only ended on March 6, 1940, when an explosive Soviet bullet struck him in the jaw, shattering it and sending him into a coma. He would survive, but his war was over. Haya's story was not just one of incredible marksmanship, it was a psychological weapon, a symbol of the lone, self-reliant Finn who could hold back the faceless Soviet masses. Stalin's wrath and the rise of Tymoshenko. The news from Finland, especially the disasters at Suomussalmi and the bloody stalemate on the isthmus, enraged Stalin. The Red Army, which he had intended to showcase as an invincible modern force, was being humiliated on the world stage. The international press mocked the Soviet Goliath, and volunteers from around the world, notably from Sweden, flocked to aid Finland's cause. Heads had to roll. In January 1940, Stalin summarily dismissed the hapless Kliment Voroshilov as the overall commander of the Finnish campaign. The commander of the Leningrad military district, Kirill Meretskov, who had authored the failed initial plan, was sidelined. Stalin needed a man who could deliver victory, regardless of the cost. He turned to Semyon Tymoshenko, a grizzled cavalryman and veteran of the Russian Civil War who had survived the purges. Tymoshenko was appointed commander of the newly formed Northwestern Front, tasked with one objective, to breach the Mannerheim line. Unlike his predecessors, Tymoshenko was a thorough and brutal planner. He understood the fundamental failures of the first offensive. He demanded and received massive reinforcements, amassing an unprecedented concentration of force. By early February, he had assembled a staggering force of over 600,000 men on the Karelian Isthmus alone, supported by over 3,000 tanks and a similar number of aircraft which now had near-total air supremacy. Tymoshenko's plan was not one of finesse, but of overwhelming, systematic brute force. He spent the remainder of January retraining his troops, improving coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, and building up colossal stockpiles of ammunition. The war was about to enter a new, far more violent phase. The art of destruction, Tymoshenko's new doctrine. On February 1, 1940, Tymoshenko unleashed his offensive. The Finnish soldiers hunkered down in their bunkers on the Mannerheim line witnessed a new kind of hell. For days on end, a continuous, deafening artillery bombardment pulverized their positions. Soviet artillery, numbering over 3,000 guns on the isthmus, fired hundreds of thousands of shells, systematically flattening trenches, shattering concrete, and turning the forested landscape into a moonscape of craters and splintered trees. This was not the uncoordinated shelling of the first offensive, this was a scientifically applied sledgehammer. Heavy bombers, flying in waves, added to the destruction, targeting rear areas and command posts. Under this rolling barrage, new tactics were employed. Instead of sending tanks and unsupported charges, Timoshenko's forces now used them as mobile pillboxes. Small groups of tanks would advance, providing covering fire for squads of infantry equipped with demolition charges who would crawl forward to attack Finnish bunkers at close range. Flamethrower tanks, the OT-130s, were used to terrifying effect, spewing liquid fire into the firing slits of Finnish strongpoints, incinerating the defenders inside. The Red Army was no longer trying to outmaneuver the Finns, it was simply trying to obliterate them. For the Finnish defenders, it was a war of pure attrition. They were exhausted, outnumbered 20-1 in some sectors, and running critically low on ammunition. They could kill Soviets by the thousands, but for every wave they repulsed, another appeared from the smoke, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades. The fall of the Mannerheim line. For 10 grueling days, the Finns held on with unimaginable tenacity. The focal point of Timoshenko's assault was the Suma sector, the linchpin of the Mannerheim line. Here, the so-called Millionaire's Bunker, Pious Bunker, and its surrounding strongpoints became the scene of a desperate, heroic defense. But sheer mass of numbers and steel eventually told. On February 11th, after a 48-hour non-stop bombardment, Soviet forces finally achieved a decisive breakthrough near Suma. Tanks and infantry poured through a gap several kilometers wide. Mannerheim's reserves were too few and too exhausted to mount an effective counterattack. The integrity of the Mannerheim line, the shield of Finland, was broken. The Finnish High Command was forced into a series of fighting withdrawals, attempting to establish new defensive lines on the frozen lakes and rivers behind the main front. But the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The Red Army, though still suffering horrific casualties for every meter gained, was now advancing with grim determination. The heroism of the Finnish soldier was unchanged, but heroism alone could not stop an avalanche of shells and a seemingly endless supply of men. The strategic situation was becoming untenable. Finland's allies, Britain and France, offered promises of an expeditionary force, but their plans were militarily unrealistic and politically complicated by the refusal of Norway and Sweden to grant transit rights. Finland was alone. The battle for Viipuri and the race against time. With the Mannerheim line breached, the Soviet advance pushed towards Viipuri, now Viborg, Finland's second-largest city and a critical strategic and psychological objective. The fighting now took place on the outskirts of the city and across the frozen expanse of Viipuri Bay. In a daring and costly operation in early March, several Soviet rifle divisions crossed the treacherous sea ice under Finnish artillery fire to establish a beachhead on the western shore of the bay, effectively outflanking the city and threatening to encircle the main body of the Finnish army on the isthmus. The Finnish defenders, a hodgepodge of exhausted frontline units and freshly mobilized troops, fought with desperate courage in the suburbs and among the islands of the bay. The battle for Viipuri became a microcosm of the entire war, incredible Finnish bravery against overwhelming Soviet mass. Meanwhile, in Moscow, diplomatic channels had quietly reopened. The Finnish government, led by Prime Minister Risto Raiti, recognized the stark reality. The army was on the verge of collapse. Ammunition was nearly gone. The promised Allied help was a phantom. Every day the war continued, Finland lost more men it could not replace and risked complete national annihilation. The fight was now a race against time. The Finnish delegation in Moscow had to secure a peace treaty, however harsh, before the army on the front disintegrated completely and the Soviets could dictate terms of unconditional surrender. The soldiers fighting and dying in the frozen ruins around Viipuri were no longer fighting for victory, but for their nation's very existence at the negotiating table. The Phantom Expeditionary Force, Allied promises, and geopolitical realities. While Finnish soldiers bled in the snows of Karelia, a complex geopolitical drama was unfolding in London and Paris. Public sympathy in the West was overwhelmingly with Finland. The heroic brave little Finland narrative had captured the world's imagination, contrasting sharply with the cynical spectacle of the Nazi-Soviet pact. Stung by their inaction during the invasion of Poland, the Allied Supreme War Council, led by Britain's Neville Chamberlain and France's Edouard Daladier, felt compelled to act. They drew up plans for an Anglo-French expeditionary force of 100,000 men to be sent to Finland's aid. However, from a purely military and logistical standpoint, the plan was deeply flawed, bordering on fantasy. The Allies had no direct sea route to Finland, as the Baltic Sea was controlled by the German Kriegsmarine and the icy northern port of Petsamo was indefensible. The only viable route was through neutral Norway and Sweden to the Finnish border. This presented the core strategic motivation for the Allies, securing the Swedish iron ore fields at Gallivare and Kiruna, which were vital to the German war machine. The plan was, in essence, to use the Finnish cause as a pretext to open a new Scandinavian front against Germany. However, both Norway and Sweden, terrified of being dragged into the war between the great powers, flatly refused to grant transit rights for Allied troops. They had seen what happened to Poland and were not willing to risk German invasion or Soviet retaliation. The planned expeditionary force, therefore, remained a phantom, a source of false hope for the Finns and a source of diplomatic friction in Scandinavia. While the Allies debated, planned, and wrangled, the Finnish army was running out of men, ammunition, and time. The air war, David's slingshot against a sky of red stars. The imbalance in the air was as stark as on the ground. The Soviet Air Force, VVS, began the war with roughly 3,000 aircraft arrayed against Finland, ranging from modern Tupolev SB-2 bombers to Polikarpov I-15 and I-16 fighters. The Finnish Air Force, Ilmavoimat, was a tiny, eclectic collection of just over 100 aircraft, its frontline fighter strength composed mainly of 30 aging Fokker D.XXI fighters. Yet, in the early stages of the war, the Finns achieved a shocking degree of success. Soviet air tactics were rigid and predictable. Bombers often flew in tight formations without adequate fighter escort, making them vulnerable. Finnish pilots, better trained in gunnery and individual tactics, punched far above their weight. A single Finnish pilot, Jorma Sarvanto, shot down 6 Soviet DB-3 bombers in the space of 4 minutes on January 6, 1940, a world record at the time. The Krieg Brewster at Tullavat. The Brewsters are coming would later become a morale booster, referring to the 44 American-made Brewster B-239 Buffalo fighters that began arriving in February. Though considered second-rate by other powers, in the hands of expert Finnish pilots, the Buffalo proved to be a formidable dogfighter against their Soviet counterparts, achieving a staggering kill-to-loss ratio. Despite these individual successes and the acquisition of new aircraft from Britain, France, and Italy, the Finns could never challenge overall Soviet air supremacy. The VVS could absorb its heavy losses and continue to bomb Finnish cities and frontline positions relentlessly. The air war mirrored the ground war. Tactical brilliance and individual heroism could win battles, but they could not overcome the sheer, attritional weight of Soviet numbers. The Finnish sky was a lonely and dangerous place. The home front, a nation mobilized by Sisu. The war was not confined to the front lines, it was a total national effort. The Finnish concept of Sisu was manifest on the home front, where every part of society was mobilized. With a significant portion of its male population under arms, women stepped into crucial roles in factories, farms, and civil defense. The Westward organization, a voluntary auxiliary paramilitary organization for women, was indispensable. Its members served as nurses, air raid spotters, communications operators, and administrative staff, freeing up thousands of men for combat duty. They worked in harrowing conditions, often close to the front lines, and became a symbol of the nation's unified resolve. The industrial disparity was immense. The Soviet Union was an industrial superpower. Finland was a largely agrarian nation with a small manufacturing base. The state-owned arms factory, Tikkakoski, worked around the clock to produce the Suomi submachine guns, but ammunition was the critical bottleneck. Every shell was precious. Rationing of food, fuel, and clothing was implemented immediately. Cities like Helsinki, Viipuri, and Turku endured repeated Soviet bombing raids. While the physical damage was less than what cities would later experience in the war, the psychological impact was significant. Yet, instead of breaking morale, the bombing seemed to harden it, reinforcing the Finnish narrative of defending their homeland against an unprovoked aggressor. The unity was remarkable. The political divisions that had scarred the nation after its 1918 civil war were largely set aside. In the face of Soviet invasion, the nation stood as one, a testament to a shared determination to remain independent. The harsh terms of peace, the Moscow negotiations. By early March 1940, Marshal Mannerheim delivered a bleak assessment to his government. The army could hold for perhaps another 10 days before a catastrophic collapse became inevitable. The breakthrough at Viipuri Bay meant the complete encirclement of the main Finnish forces was imminent. The diplomatic endgame had arrived. A Finnish delegation, including Prime Minister Raiti, traveled to Moscow to face Vyacheslav Molotov. The Soviets, having paid a humiliatingly high price in blood for their gains, were in no mood for compromise. Their initial demands from before the war now seemed mild in comparison. The new terms laid out by Molotov were brutal. Finland was to cede the entire Karelian Isthmus, including its second-largest city, Viipuri, and the shores of Lake Ladoga. It had to cede a swath of territory in the Salla region, severing the rail line to the north. Furthermore, it had to lease the Hanko Peninsula at the mouth of the Gulf of Finland to the Soviets for 30 years as a naval base. In total, Finland was to lose over 11% of its territory, which included some of its most fertile agricultural land and 30% of its economic assets. For the 430,000 Finns living in the ceded areas, 12% of the nation's population, it meant the immediate loss of their homes and livelihoods. Faced with the alternative of complete military defeat and Soviet occupation, the Finnish government had no choice. The delegation argued, pleaded, and attempted to bargain, but Molotov was immovable. The choice was simple: sign or be annihilated. The end of the Winter War, a bitter victory, a mournful peace. On the night of March 12, 1940, with Soviet troops fighting in the suburbs of Viipuri, the Finnish delegation in Moscow signed the peace treaty. A ceasefire was to take effect the next day at 11 a.m. As the news reached the front, the reaction among the Finnish soldiers was one of shock, disbelief, and profound bitterness. They had not been defeated in spirit. They had held the line, bled the Red Army white, and felt they could still fight. Now, they were being ordered to lay down their arms and surrender lands they had successfully defended at an immense cost. The war had lasted 105 days. Finland remained an independent, sovereign nation, a monumental achievement in itself. They had inflicted staggering casualties on the Red Army. While precise Soviet losses are still debated by historians, conservative estimates place their dead at over 126,000, with total casualties approaching 400,000. They lost over 2,000 tanks and 700 aircraft. Finland, by contrast, suffered around 26,000 dead and 44,000 wounded. In tactical terms, it was a Finnish victory. But in strategic terms, it was a crushing defeat. The loss of territory was a devastating blow. As the ceasefire took hold on March 13, an eerie silence fell over the front. In Helsinki, the flags were lowered to half-mast. There were no celebrations. The Finns had won the admiration of the world, but they had lost the war. The peace they had secured was seen by many not as a conclusion, but as a temporary, unjust armistice. This sense of a continuation war being inevitable would have profound and tragic consequences for Finland's future path in the wider global conflict. The global reckoning, Hitler's miscalculation. The Winter War was watched with intense interest from Berlin. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command, OKW, observed the Red Army's dismal performance with a mixture of contempt and encouragement. The Soviet military machine, which they knew they would likely have to face one day, appeared to be a clumsy, poorly led, and tactically inept giant. The purge of the officer corps by Stalin had evidently crippled its effectiveness far more than German intelligence had previously estimated. In a private meeting, Hitler reportedly remarked that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay and that one good kick would bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. This assessment, based almost entirely on the Red Army's initial failures in Finland, would profoundly influence his decision to launch Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, just 18 months later. He fatally underestimated the Soviet Union's ability to learn, adapt, and absorb massive punishment. He saw only the incompetence of the first offensive, not the brutal, methodical efficiency of the second. The Red Army's ability to recover under Timoshenko, to accept astronomical casualties, and to achieve its strategic objectives through sheer mass and attrition was a vital lesson that was dangerously overlooked by the Nazi leadership. The Winter War thus contributed directly to one of the greatest strategic miscalculations in military history, luring Hitler into a belief that a swift victory in the East was not only possible, but probable. The Soviet autopsy, purges, reforms, and a painful revival. For Josef Stalin, the Winter War was a profound and private humiliation, but also a crucial wake-up call. The Red Army's performance had exposed deep-seated institutional rot. While the state-controlled press hailed the glorious victory, Stalin knew the truth. The cost had been catastrophic and the army's prestige was in tatters. In a closed-door meeting with his generals in April 1940, Stalin conducted a ruthless postmortem. He acknowledged the failures in leadership, coordination, and equipment. The war demonstrated the folly of abolishing traditional military ranks and empowering political commissars to interfere with tactical decisions. Consequently, a series of sweeping reforms were instituted. Traditional ranks for generals and admirals were restored. The authority of the political commissars was curtailed, placing military command back in the hands of trained officers. Training doctrines were overhauled, with a new emphasis on combined arms operations, winter warfare, and realistic field exercises. There was also a renewed focus on equipment. The shortcomings of the T-26 and BT tanks against even improvised defenses spurred the accelerated development and production of the next generation of Soviet armor, the T-34 medium tank and the KV-1 heavy tank. These vehicles, which would shock the Wehrmacht in 1941, were a direct result of the lessons learned in the Finnish snow. The Winter War, in effect, forced Stalin to begin rebuilding the Red Army from the damage his own purges had wrought. It was a painful, bloody, and incomplete process, but without it, the catastrophe of 1941 might have been absolute. The legacy of the Mannerheim line, a doctrine of defense. The Mannerheim line has entered military folklore as a symbol of indomitable defense, often incorrectly imagined as a solid wall of concrete and steel. Its true significance, as revealed by archival engineering plans and after-action reports, lay in its design philosophy. It was not a single line, but a defense in-depth zone, roughly 40 to 60 kilometers deep. Its strength was not in the sheer number of its bunkers, there were only about 160 concrete structures along the entire isthmus, but in how they were integrated with the natural terrain. Marshal Mannerheim, leveraging his deep understanding of the landscape, ensured that the line used lakes, rivers, swamps, and dense forests as natural anti-tank obstacles. The concrete bunkers were often small, designed primarily for machine gun nests and command posts, not for housing large numbers of troops or heavy artillery like the Maginot Line. Their firing slits were cleverly angled to create interlocking fields of fire, channeling attackers into pre-planned killing zones. The Finns perfected the use of natural and man-made obstacles, from felled forests, abatis, to massive anti-tank granite boulders known as Dragon's Teeth. The key lesson, studied by military theorists after the war, was that a well-planned defensive system that enhances the natural strengths of the terrain can multiply the effectiveness of a smaller defending force. It proved that a static defense could be formidable if it was flexible, deep, and intelligently designed, rather than being a single, brittle shell. The Mannerheim line fell not because it was flawed in concept, but because the force brought against it was simply too overwhelming for the limited resources of the defenders. The plight of the evacuees and the seeds of the continuation war. The peace treaty forced one of the largest and most rapid population transfers of the war. Over 430,000 Finns, the entire population of the ceded Karelian territories, chose to abandon their homes, farms, and businesses rather than live under Soviet rule. This mass evacuation was a monumental logistical and humanitarian challenge for a nation already battered by war. Special trains and convoys were organized to move people and what few possessions they could carry into the remaining parts of Finland. The government passed emergency legislation to resettle and compensate the evacuees, a process that placed enormous strain on the national economy and social fabric. For the Karelian evacuees, the loss was profound and personal. They had lost their ancestral homes and their entire way of life. This collective trauma, shared by over a tenth of the nation's population, created a powerful political and social movement within Finland. The desire to reclaim the lost lands of Karelia became a national obsession. This sentiment, known as the Karelian question, fostered a deep-seated revanchism and a burning sense of injustice. It made the peace of 1940 feel like a temporary, unacceptable truce. When Germany began planning its invasion of the Soviet Union, it found a willing and motivated partner in Finland. The Finnish government, seeing an opportunity to reverse the losses of the Winter War, allied itself with Nazi Germany. On June 25, 1941, following German and Soviet attacks from Finnish soil, the next chapter of the conflict began, the Continuation War. The bitter peace had lasted only 15 months. Final analysis, a Pyrrhic victory and a defining legacy. In the final analysis from the archives, the Winter War stands as a conflict rich in paradox. For the Soviet Union, it was a Pyrrhic victory of the highest order. It achieved its strategic territorial goals, securing Leningrad's flank, but at a cost that exposed the Red Army as a dysfunctional behemoth and emboldened its greatest adversary. The war served as a brutal but necessary catalyst for military reforms that would be crucial for its ultimate survival. For Finland, it was a victorious defeat. The nation preserved its sovereignty, a feat no other small country on the Soviet border managed to do, but at the cost of significant territory, economic devastation, and thousands of lives. The war forged a powerful national identity and the legend of Sisu, but it also set Finland on a perilous path that would lead it into an alliance with Nazi Germany and another devastating war against the Soviets. The Winter War was more than just a sideshow to the main events unfolding in Europe. It was a crucible that tested nations and ideologies. It showcased the power of individual courage, masterful defensive tactics, and national will against impossible odds, Motti, Simo, Sisu. It also demonstrated the brutal, attritional logic of modern industrial warfare, where overwhelming mass can eventually crush even the most brilliant and heroic defense. Its lessons, both learned and ignored, directly shaped the subsequent course of the Second World War, from Hitler's catastrophic decision to invade Russia to the Red Army's painful transformation into the force that would one day march into Berlin. The 105 days of the Winter War were a stark, frozen prelude to the horrors and complexities that were to come.